The emergency alarm screamed through the corridors of mining station Zirion 7 like the dying breath of some great beast. Red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous glow as Jake Martinez sprinted down the metal hallway, his magnetic boots clanking against the deck plates with each hurried step. "All personnel evacuate immediately." The automated voice echoed coldly. "Hull breach in sections 12 through 18. Containment failure imminent." Jake wasn't supposed to be here. His shift had ended 3 hours ago, but he'd stayed behind to finish repairs on the atmospheric processors. Now that dedication might cost him his life. The station shuddered around him as another explosion rocked the superstructure. Through the viewport windows, he could see the twisted wreckage where a cargo hauler had crashed into the station's docking ring. The alien ship had come out of nowhere, its engines failing at the worst possible moment. The pilot had tried to pull away at the last second, but momentum and physics don't care about good intentions. The impact had torn through the outer hull like paper, and now atmosphere was venting into space while fires spread through the damaged sections. Jake reached the evacuation point to find it empty. The last escape pod had already launched, leaving behind only silence and the steady hiss of escaping air. His communicator crackled to life. "Martinez, where the hell are you?" Captain Chen's voice cut through the static. "The station's going to break apart in 15 minutes. "I'm at evacuation point Delta," Jake replied, checking the pod bay. "All pods are gone." "Damn it." "There's a maintenance shuttle in Bay 7, but you'll have to cross through the damaged sections to get there." Jake's blood ran cold. The damaged sections were filled with fires, toxic smoke, and areas where the hull had been completely breached. It would be like running through hell itself. "Roger that, Captain. On my way." He sealed his emergency suit and activated the oxygen recycler. The suit wasn't designed for extended use in hard vacuum, but it would keep him alive long enough to reach the shuttle bay. Jake began making his way through the station, following the emergency lighting toward Bay 7. The first damaged section he encountered made his stomach lurch. What had once been a clean, functional corridor was now a twisted nightmare of bent metal and sparking electronics. The air tasted of smoke and burning plastic despite his suit's filters. Emergency foam had sealed some of the smaller breaches, but Jake could see stars twinkling through larger holes in the outer hull. As he climbed through a particularly narrow gap between two collapsed support beams, he heard something that made him freeze. It was faint, almost lost in the groaning of stressed metal and the hiss of atmosphere leaks, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. Jake paused, listening carefully. There it was again, a soft whimpering sound coming from somewhere deeper in the wreckage. His first instinct was to ignore it and keep moving. He had maybe 10 minutes before the station's superstructure failed completely. But the sound tugged at something deep in his chest, something that wouldn't let him just walk away. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like panicked breathing. Jake began following the sound, using his suit's emergency lights to illuminate the twisted debris. The path led him deeper into the damaged section, where the destruction was even worse. "I'm here to help," Jake called out in his best reassuring tone. "I'm human. I won't hurt you." A small voice responded, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. But the universal translator in his suit caught enough of it to provide a rough interpretation. "Please, help, trapped." Jake's lights finally found the source of the voice. Trapped beneath a fallen support beam was a young alien girl, probably no more than 12 years old by human standards. She belonged to the Zilani race. He recognized the distinctive blue-tinted skin, large dark eyes, and the delicate ridges that ran along her temples. Her right leg was pinned beneath the beam, and there was a cut on her forehead that was bleeding purple blood. The Zilani were one of the newer species to join the Galactic Council. They were known for being peaceful, intelligent, and somewhat fragile compared to most other races. This girl looked terrified, her large eyes wide with fear and pain. "It's okay," Jake said softly, approaching slowly so he wouldn't scare her further. "I'm going to get you out of here." The girl said something in Zilani that his translator rendered as, the fire is coming." Jake looked around and felt his heart sink. She was right. The electrical fires that had been contained to other sections were spreading through the damaged wiring, and he could see orange flames beginning to lick at the far end of the corridor. They were running out of time fast. He knelt down next to the trapped beam and examined the situation. The support beam was made of reinforced titanium alloy, designed to hold up an entire section of the station. It would take heavy equipment to move it safely. But Jake didn't have heavy equipment, and they didn't have time to wait for a rescue team. "What's your name?" he asked the girl while he worked to assess their options. "Lyra," she replied in accented standard. I was with my father. We came to trade." "Where is your father now?" Lyra's eyes filled with tears. "He pushed me away when the ship hit. I saw him fall into space through the big hole." Her voice broke on the last words. Jake's chest tightened. The girl had just lost her father and was now trapped in a burning station that was about to break apart. She was probably going to die here, and there wasn't much he could do about it. But that wasn't how Jake Martinez was built. He stood up and grabbed the support beam with both hands, testing its weight. It was heavy, probably 3 times what he could normally lift. But adrenaline and desperation could make people do impossible things. "Lyra, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said. "When I lift this beam, you need to pull yourself out as fast as you can. Do you understand?" She nodded, though her face was pale with shock and pain. Jake took a deep breath and bent his knees. The proper lifting form his old football coach had drilled into him came back automatically. Keep your back straight, lift with your legs, don't jerk the weight. Of course, his coach had never mentioned anything about lifting multi-ton support beams in a burning space station. He gripped the beam and pulled with everything he had. For a moment, nothing happened. The beam was simply too heavy, designed to support loads that no single person should ever be able to move. Jake's muscles strained against physics and engineering, and physics seemed to be winning. Then, something changed. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was pure stubborn human refusal to accept defeat, but the beam began to rise. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Jake lifted the crushing weight off the girl's leg. "Now," he grunted through clenched teeth. Lyra scrambled backward, pulling her injured leg free just as Jake's strength finally gave out. The beam crashed back down with a sound like thunder, and Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. "Are you hurt?" he asked when he could speak again. Lyra tested her leg carefully. "I think it is broken, but I can walk a little." The fires were getting closer now, and Jake could feel the heat through his suit. They needed to move fast. He helped Lyra to her feet and let her lean on him for support. "We need to get to the shuttle bay," he explained. "It's not far, but we have to go through some dangerous areas." As they made their way through the wreckage, Jake couldn't help but notice how light Lyra was. The Zilani had evolved on a low-gravity world, and their bone structure was more delicate than humans. It was probably why the support beam had broken her leg instead of crushing it completely. They reached another damaged section where a large section of the outer hull had been torn away. Through the gap, Jake could see the vast emptiness of space and the distant glow of the system's star. The emergency foam had sealed most of the breach, but there were still small gaps where atmosphere was leaking out. "Stay close to me," Jake warned. "If the foam fails, we'll be sucked into space." They picked their way carefully along the edge of the breach, step by step. Lyra was breathing hard from pain and exertion, but she didn't complain. Jake found himself impressed by her courage. Most adults would be panicking in this situation. They were halfway across when disaster struck. A piece of debris, loosened by the station's continuing structural damage, fell and punched through the emergency foam. Immediately, the gap began to widen as atmosphere rushed out into space. Jake felt the pull of decompression and grabbed onto a nearby support rail. With his other arm, he pulled Lyra against him, shielding her smaller body with his own. The suction was incredible, trying to drag them both toward the growing breach. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of escaping air. For several terrifying seconds, they hung there while Jake's grip on the rail was the only thing keeping them from being blown into space. His shoulder felt like it was going to dislocate, and he could feel his fingers beginning to slip. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the atmospheric leak stopped. The emergency systems had detected the hull breach and sealed off this section from the rest of the station. They were safe for the moment, but now they were trapped in an area with no atmosphere. Jake checked his suit's air supply. 15 minutes remaining. Lyra's emergency mask would give her maybe 10 minutes. They needed to find another way to the shuttle bay, and they needed to find it fast. This way, he said, pointing to an emergency hatch that led to the maintenance tunnels. We'll have to crawl, but it should take us around the damaged sections. The maintenance tunnels were cramped and dark, barely large enough for a human to crawl through. For Jake, it was uncomfortable. For Lyra, with her injured leg, it must have been agony. But she followed him without complaint, pulling herself forward with her arms when her leg wouldn't support her weight. They emerged from the tunnels into a section that was still intact, with atmosphere and working lights. Jake helped Lyra remove her emergency mask so she could breathe normally. "How much further?" she asked. "Not far now. Maybe 5 more minutes." But, as they continued toward the shuttle bay, Jake became aware of a new problem. The station was beginning to break apart. He could feel it in the way the deck plates shifted slightly under his feet, in the groaning sounds that echoed through the corridors. The structural damage from the crash was spreading, and it wouldn't be long before the entire station came apart. They rounded a corner and Jake's heart sank. The corridor ahead was completely blocked by fallen debris from a collapsed ceiling. There was no way through, and no time to find another route. "What do we do now?" Lyra asked, seeing the despair on his face. Jake looked around desperately. There had to be another way. There was always another way. His eyes fell on an emergency airlock marked External Maintenance Access. It was designed to allow engineers to work on the station's exterior, but it could also provide a way around the blocked corridor. "We're going outside," he announced. Lyra's eyes went wide. "Outside? In space? It's the only way." "The maintenance walkway runs along the exterior of this section. We can use it to reach the shuttle bay." Jake checked the emergency suit locker next to the airlock. There was one adult suit and one child-sized suit designed for young human technicians. The child suit would be too big for Lyra, but it would have to do. He helped her into the suit, adjusting the straps and seals as best he could. The helmet was too large, but the neck seal was tight enough to maintain pressure. "Remember," he told her as they prepared to cycle through the airlock, "stay close to me and hold onto the guide rail at all times. If you let go, you'll float away into space and I won't be able to catch you." Lyra nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. The airlock cycled, and suddenly, they were outside the station, floating in the vacuum of space. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Stars stretched out in every direction, and below them the curved surface of the planet the station orbited. But there was no time to appreciate the view. The maintenance walkway was a narrow metal grating that ran along the station's hull. In normal circumstances, it would be perfectly safe. The magnetic strips in their boots would keep them attached to the metal surface. But these weren't normal circumstances. Parts of the walkway had been damaged by the crash, and Jake could see gaps where sections had been torn away. They began making their way along the walkway, step by careful step. Lyra was doing well, keeping close to the guide rail and moving slowly but steadily. Jake stayed right behind her, ready to grab her if she slipped. They were nearly to the shuttle bay when the station shuddered again. This time the movement was different, more violent, more final. Jake looked back and saw that one of the main support struts had failed. The section they had just left was beginning to separate from the rest of the station. "Hurry," he called to Lyra. She tried to move faster, but her injured leg betrayed her. She stumbled, and for a heart-stopping moment she began to float away from the walkway. Jake lunged forward and caught her hand just as she was about to drift beyond reach. For a moment they hung there, Jake's magnetic boots the only thing anchoring them both to the station. Lyra was surprisingly heavy in the zero-G environment, or maybe Jake was just exhausted from everything they'd been through. "I've got you," he grunted, pulling her back to the walkway. Just a little further. The shuttle bay access hatch was just ahead. Jake cycled them through the airlock and they stumbled into the bay, both gasping for breath. The shuttle was there, exactly as Captain Chen had said it would be. Jake ran through the startup sequence as fast as he could. The station was coming apart around them, and they needed to be gone before the shuttle bay was compromised. The engines came online with a satisfying hum, and Jake felt the magnetic clamps release the shuttle from its docking port. They launched just as the section of the station they'd been in broke away completely. Through the shuttle's rear viewport, Jake watched mining station Zirion 7 tear itself apart in a shower of sparks and venting atmosphere. "We made it," Lyra whispered, staring at the destruction in awe. "Yeah," Jake replied, setting course for the nearest inhabited system. "We made it." As they flew away from the dying station, Jake couldn't help but think about what had just happened. He had risked his own life to save a complete stranger, an alien girl he had never met before and might never see again. Most people would call that crazy. But, looking at Lyra's grateful face, Jake knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. That was just who humans were. When someone needed help, you helped them. It didn't matter if they were human or alien, friend or stranger. It was what made humanity special in a galaxy full of different species. Not their technology or their military might, but their willingness to put themselves at risk for others. As they headed toward safety, Jake began to transmit their rescue signal. Soon, other ships would respond, and Lyra would be reunited with whatever family she had left. But, for now, they were safe. They had survived the fire, and they were alive. And, sometimes, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since the destruction of mining station Zirion 7, and Jake Martinez found himself in a place he never expected to be, sitting in the luxurious passenger compartment of a Zilani diplomatic vessel, watching the blue-green world of Zilanos grow larger in the viewports. After their rescue, Lyra had been treated at the medical facility on Kepler Station. Her broken leg had healed quickly thanks to advanced alien medicine, but she had insisted on one thing before returning home: Jake had to come with her. "My people need to know what you did," she had explained in her careful standard. "They need to understand what humans are really like." Jake hadn't wanted to go. He was just a maintenance engineer, not a diplomat or a hero. He'd simply done what any decent person would do in that situation. But Lyra had been persistent, and eventually Captain Chen had convinced him that it would be good for human-Zilani relations. Now, as their ship descended through Zilanos' atmosphere, Jake was starting to regret his decision. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see vast cities that looked like they had been grown rather than built, with spires and domes that curved organically into the sky. Everything was beautiful in a way that human architecture never quite achieved, all flowing lines and harmony with the natural landscape. Nervous, asked Commander Sarah Blake, the diplomatic attaché who had been assigned to accompany Jake on this trip. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who spoke several alien languages and had spent most of her career smoothing over the rough edges of human-alien contact. Terrified, Jake admitted, "I'm going to be meeting with their planetary council. I fix air recyclers for a living. I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy." "Just be yourself," Blake advised. That's what impressed Lyra, and it's what will impress them. The Zilani value sincerity above all else. The ship touched down at a spaceport that looked more like a garden than a landing field. Instead of harsh concrete and metal, the landing pads were surrounded by carefully cultivated plants and flowing water features. Even the control tower was covered in living vines that helped to filter the atmosphere. Jake and Commander Blake were met by an official delegation that included Lyra herself, now dressed in formal robes that marked her as a member of an important family. She had grown some in the 3 weeks since the station incident. Zilani children developed faster than humans, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years. "Jake," she called out, breaking protocol to run up and embrace him. "You came." "Of course I came," Jake replied, awkwardly patting her on the shoulder. "I told you I would." The leader of the delegation was an elderly Zilani male with silver-white skin and deep ridges along his temples that indicated great age and wisdom. he stepped forward and spoke in accented standard. "I am Elder Voss, Speaker for the Council. We are honored to welcome the human Jake Martinez to our world." Jake wasn't sure if he was supposed to bow or shake hands or what, so he settled for a polite nod. "Thank you for having me, Elder Voss. I'm honored to be here." "The honor is ours," Voss replied. "What you did for young Lyra has resonated throughout our people. We are eager to hear your account of the events." They were transported to the capital city in vehicles that floated silently above the ground, powered by some kind of anti-grav technology that Jake found fascinating. The city itself was even more impressive up close, buildings that spiraled gracefully into the sky, connected by bridges that looked like they had been woven from living wood. The Zalani Council chamber was a circular amphitheater with tiers of seats rising up from a central speaking area. Each seat was occupied by a Zalani counselor, and Jake estimated there were at least 200 of them. At the center of the room was a simple podium where Jake would be expected to tell his story. "Don't be intimidated," Lyra whispered to him as they prepared to enter. "They're not judging you. They're trying to understand you." Jake nodded, though his mouth felt dry and his palms were sweating. He had never spoken in public before, let alone to the ruling council of an alien world. Elder Voss introduced him with a formal speech about human-Zalani friendship and the importance of understanding between different species. Then, it was Jake's turn to speak. He approached the podium slowly, looking out at the sea of alien faces watching him with curious, intelligent eyes. For a moment, he felt completely overwhelmed. What could he possibly say to these people that would matter? Then, he saw Lyra in the front row, smiling encouragingly at him, and he remembered why he was here. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice echoing clearly in the chamber, "I was just trying to finish my shift and go home. I wasn't planning to be a hero or make history. I was just a guy who wanted to get his work done and maybe catch a movie on the entertainment channel before going to sleep." A few of the counselors leaned forward, apparently intrigued by his casual tone. Most diplomatic speeches they heard were probably much more formal. "But sometimes life doesn't care about your plans," Jake continued. "Sometimes circumstances put you in a position where you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And, when that happens, you find out what kind of person you really are." Jake went on to describe the events at the mining station in detail, starting with the crash and continuing through their escape. He tried to be honest about his fear, his doubts, and the moments when he wasn't sure they would make it. The counselors listened in complete silence, their large dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was both flattering and unnerving. When he described lifting the support beam to free Lyra, there was a murmur that ran through the chamber. Jake paused, wondering if he had said something wrong. "Please continue," Elder Voss encouraged. Jake finished his story with their escape from the station and rescue by the relief ships. When he was done, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, one of the counselors stood up. She was middle-aged by Zalani standards, with the deep blue skin that indicated high rank in their society. "Human Jake Martinez," she said formally, "I am Counselor Mira, specialist in xenobiology and interspecies relations. I have studied the structural specifications of mining station Zirian 7. The support beam that trapped young Lyra weighed approximately 4,000 kilograms. Our analysis indicates that lifting such a weight should have been physically impossible for a human male of your size and build." Jake felt a flush of embarrassment. "I know it sounds unbelievable, but I swear I'm telling the truth. I really did lift that beam." "We do not question your truthfulness," Counselor Mira continued. "What we question is our understanding of human capabilities. How did you accomplish this feat?" Jake thought about it for a moment. "I don't really know," he admitted. "Adrenaline, I suppose. When people are in extreme situations, sometimes they can do things that shouldn't be possible. We call it hysterical strength." "This is a common human trait?" another counselor asked. "Well, not common exactly. But it happens often enough that we have medical studies about it. Mothers lifting cars to save their children, that sort of thing." The counselors began murmuring among themselves in their own language. Jake caught enough of it through his translator to understand that they were discussing the biological mechanisms that might allow such strength enhancement. Elder Voss raised his hand for silence. This is indeed fascinating, but I believe we are missing the larger significance of Human Martinez's actions. The question is not how he lifted the beam, but why. I don't understand, Jake said. You risked your own life for a being you had never met before, Voss explained. A being of a different species, from a world you had never visited, with whom you shared no blood relation or tribal affiliation. This behavior seems to contradict the basic survival instincts that drive most intelligent species. Jake frowned. Are you saying that other species wouldn't have helped? I am saying that most species would have calculated the risk versus benefit before acting, Voss replied carefully. You had less than 15 minutes to escape the station. Stopping to rescue Lyra reduced your own chances of survival significantly. Yet you did not hesitate. Why? The question caught Jake off guard. He had never really thought about why he had helped Lyra. It had just seemed like the obvious thing to do. Because she needed help, he said finally. Because she was scared and hurt and alone, and I was the only one who could do anything about it. How could I just leave her there? But she was not your responsibility, another counselor pointed out. You had no obligation to risk yourself for her. Maybe not legally, Jake said, feeling a bit defensive. But morally? Of course I did. We all have an obligation to help each other when we can. That's what makes us civilized. The murmuring in the chamber grew louder, and Jake began to worry that he had offended them somehow. But Lyra was smiling broadly, and Elder Voss looked thoughtful rather than angry. Human Martinez, Voss said finally, you speak of this moral obligation as if it were a universal truth. But I must tell you that this perspective is unusual among the species we have encountered. What do you mean? Counselor Miras stood again. Most intelligent species develop along similar evolutionary paths. Competition for resources, tribal loyalties, cost-benefit analysis and social interactions. What you describe, this willingness to risk everything for a complete stranger, runs counter to the evolutionary pressures that shape intelligent behavior. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying that humans are the only ones who would help strangers? Not the only ones, Voss clarified. But, perhaps the most, consistent in this behavior. We have studied the histories of a dozen different species, and, while all show occasional examples of self-sacrifice for others, humans appear to have institutionalized this behavior in ways that other species find remarkable. I still don't understand what's so special about it, Jake said. It just seems like common decency. That is exactly what makes it special, Lyra spoke up from the front row. When I was trapped under that beam, I knew I was going to die. My father was gone, the station was breaking apart, and I was alone. Then, you appeared, and you didn't even think about whether you should help me. You just did it. She stood up and looked around the chamber. My people are good people, but we are also careful people. We calculate risks, we consider consequences, we think before we act. If one of us had found me in that situation, they would have wanted to help, but they would have spent precious time trying to figure out the safest way to do it. And, by then, it would have been too late, another counselor observed. Exactly, Lyra said. But Jake didn't hesitate. He saw someone who needed help and he helped, even though it put him in danger. That's not just bravery, that's something deeper. Elder Voss nodded slowly. This is why we wanted to meet you, Human Martinez. The Zilani have been members of the Galactic Council for only 50 standard years. We are still learning about the other species we share the galaxy with. Your actions have given us new insight into the nature of humanity. What kind of insight? Jake asked. That perhaps the human approach to morality, this instinctive willingness to help others regardless of personal cost, represents something valuable that the galaxy has been lacking. Jake felt uncomfortable with the weight of what Voss was suggesting. I'm not sure humanity is as noble as you're making us sound. We have our share of problems and conflicts. Of course, Voss agreed. No species is perfect. But every species brings unique strengths to the galactic community. The Zarathi contribute their technological innovations, the Makari offer their wisdom and energy manipulation, the Korvan provide military expertise. Perhaps humanity's contribution is this moral imperative you demonstrate, the willingness to risk everything for the welfare of others. Commander Blake stepped forward. Elder Voss, what exactly are you suggesting? I am suggesting that the Galactic Council would benefit from greater human participation in our decision-making processes. Too often, our debates focus on practical considerations while ignoring the moral implications of our choices. You want humans to join the Galactic Council? Jake asked in surprise. Your species was already being considered for membership, Voss replied. But, there has been some resistance from certain quarters who view humans as too aggressive and unpredictable. What happened on mining station Zirian 7 has changed some minds. Jake looked around the chamber, taking in the faces of the alien counselors. They were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and respect that was both flattering and intimidating. I'm just one person, he said finally. I can't speak for all of humanity. But, you can speak for the values that humanity represents, Lyra said. The same values that saved my life. Elder Voss stood up, and the entire chamber fell silent. Human Jake Martinez, the Zalani Council wishes to formally nominate your species for full membership in the Galactic Council. We believe that the moral perspective humanity brings to difficult decisions will benefit all the member species. The chamber erupted in discussion as counselors began debating the proposal among themselves. Jake stood at the podium, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. He had come to Zalanos thinking he was just going to tell a story about a rescue. Instead, he had apparently just helped humanity take a major step toward full membership in the galactic community. What happens now? He asked Commander Blake. Now we go home and report to Earth, she replied with a smile. And, then, the real diplomacy begins. As the session ended and the counselors began filing out, Lyra approached the podium with Elder Voss. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. You don't have to thank me, Jake replied. I'm just glad you're safe. You still don't understand, do you? Voss observed with what might have been amusement. You have just changed the course of galactic history, Human Martinez. And, you did it by simply being yourself. Jake looked out at the alien city visible through the chamber's windows, the flowing architecture, the carefully tended gardens, the peaceful harmony of it all. It was beautiful, but it was also foreign in ways that went beyond mere appearance. Perhaps that was what the galaxy needed, not just different technologies or military capabilities, but fundamentally different ways of thinking about right and wrong, about the obligations individuals had to one another. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Jake realized that his life would never be quite the same. He might still be a maintenance engineer when he got home, but he was also now a symbol of human values in the eyes of the galactic community. It was a responsibility he had never asked for, but one he was determined to live up to. After all, that was what humans did. When someone needed help, you helped them. Even if that someone was an entire galaxy. 2 months after his visit to Zalanos, Jake Martinez found himself in another impossible situation. He was standing in the observation deck of Harmony Station, the massive space station that served as the headquarters for the Galactic Council, watching dozens of different alien ships arrive for what would be the most important session in the Council's 300-year history. The formal vote on human membership in the Galactic Council was scheduled for tomorrow, and representatives from over 40 different species had come to participate. Through the viewing ports, Jake could see ships of every conceivable design, some sleek and angular like works of art, others bulky and functional, still others so alien that he couldn't even guess how they moved through space. Nervous? Asked Ambassador Patricia Wells, Earth's lead representative for the membership negotiations. She was a career diplomat who had spent the last 6 months traveling between different worlds, building support for humanity's application. Beyond nervous, Jake admitted. I still can't believe I'm here. 6 months ago I was fixing air recyclers on a mining station. Now I'm supposed to help represent all of humanity to the galaxy. You're here because you've already proven what humanity is capable of, Wells reminded him. The story of what you did for Lyra has spread to every member world. You've become a symbol. Jake wasn't comfortable with being a symbol. He preferred being just a regular person who fixed things when they broke. But the events of the last few months had made it clear that he didn't get to choose his role in history. The formal session wouldn't begin until tomorrow, but tonight there was a reception where representatives from different species could meet informally and discuss the issues. Jake had been dreading it all day. The idea of making small talk with aliens from dozens of different worlds was terrifying. Remember, Wells advised as they prepared to enter the reception hall, just be yourself. That's what got us this far. The reception was held in one of the station's largest chambers, a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of the stars outside. The space was filled with beings from across the galaxy, some humanoid, others so alien that Jake had trouble figuring out which end was the front. Jake found himself gravitating toward a group that included several species he recognized from his briefings. There were the Zilani, of course, including Elder Voss and Lyra, who had both come to support humanity's application. Near them stood representatives of the Corvan Empire, tall insectoid beings with chitinous exoskeletons and compound eyes that reflected the rune's lights like mirrors. Human Jake Martinez, a voice called out behind him. He turned to see a being he didn't recognize approaching, roughly humanoid but with skin that seemed to shift color as it moved, cycling through shades of blue and green. I am Kethvar of the Chameleon Syndicate, the being said, extending what Jake assumed was a hand. I have heard much about your actions on mining station Zirian 7. Jake shook the offered appendage carefully. Pleased to meet you. I'm sorry, but I'm not familiar with the Chameleon Syndicate. We are a newer member of the council, Kethvar replied. We joined only 20 years ago. I must say, your species application has generated more discussion than any membership proposal in recent memory. Good discussion or bad discussion? Jake asked. Kethvar's skin shifted to a deeper blue. Mixed, I'm afraid. There are those who admire what you did, but others who find human behavior unpredictable. Before Jake could ask what that meant, another voice interrupted them. Ah, the famous human Martinez. The speaker was a Corvan, its mandibles clicking as it spoke standard. I am War Leader ZXTH. We have been most interested in your species' military capabilities. Jake felt a chill. The Corvan were the galaxy's premier military power, and their interest in human military capabilities probably wasn't a good thing. I'm not a soldier, Jake said carefully. I'm an engineer. Indeed, ZXTH replied. Yet you demonstrated strength levels that our analysis suggests should be impossible for a being of your size. Our scientists are most curious about the biological mechanisms involved. It was just adrenaline, Jake protested. Nothing special. Nothing special? ZXTH's compound eyes seemed to focus more intently on him. Human Martinez, you lifted a 4,000 kilogram support beam with no mechanical assistance. Our strongest warriors could not accomplish such a feat. Maybe that's because your strongest warriors are smart enough not to try, Jake suggested. The clicking of ZXTH's mandibles sounded almost like laughter. Perhaps. Or perhaps humans possess capabilities that we do not fully understand. Jake was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Elder Voss, who approached with what Jake had learned was the Zilani equivalent of a polite smile. War Leader ZXTH, Voss said formally. I hope you are not interrogating our human friend too aggressively. Merely satisfying curiosity, ZXTH replied. The Corvan Empire wishes to understand what we may be dealing with if humans join the council. What you will be dealing with, interrupted a new voice, is a species that thinks with its emotions rather than its intellect. The speaker was tall and thin, with pale gray skin and large black eyes that seemed to take in everything. Jake recognized the species from his briefings, the Ethereal Collective, one of the galaxy's most ancient and technologically advanced civilizations. Ethereal Prime Scholar Vextal, Elder Voss said stiffly. I was not aware you had arrived. I arrived this morning, Vextal replied, those black eyes fixed on Jake with uncomfortable intensity. I felt it was important to observe this human Martinez in person before the vote. Jake extended his hand for a handshake, but Vextal simply stared at it until he let it drop. "Your species fascinates us, human Martinez," the ethereal said. "Not for your strength or your technology, but for your complete irrationality." "I beg your pardon?" "You risked your life for a being you had never met, with no possibility of personal gain and significant chance of death. From any logical standpoint, your behavior was completely irrational." Jake felt his temper beginning to rise. Maybe helping people doesn't have to be logical. "Precisely our point," Vextal continued. "Most intelligent species develop beyond such primitive emotional responses. We make decisions based on logic, efficiency, and optimal outcomes. You appear to make them based on feelings." "And what's wrong with that?" Jake shot back. "Nothing is wrong with it," Vextal replied calmly. "It is simply limited. Decisions made from emotion tend to create more problems than they solve." Elder Voss stepped forward diplomatically. "Perhaps we might agree that different approaches to decision-making can complement each other." "Perhaps," Vextal said, though his tone suggested he doubted it. "We shall see what the council decides tomorrow." As the ethereal moved away, Jake found himself fighting down a surge of anger. The casual dismissal of human moral values as primitive emotional responses stung more than he wanted to admit. "Don't let him get to you," a voice said beside him. Jake turned to see a being he hadn't met before, short and stocky with rock-like skin and small, bright eyes. "I'm Granite Singer Thok of the Stoneheart Confederation," the being said. "And I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding us that strength isn't always about logic and efficiency," Thok replied. "My people are miners, like many of yours. We understand what it means to put your life on the line for someone else." Jake felt some of his anger fade. "It's good to know not everyone thinks we're crazy." "Oh, you're definitely crazy," Thok said with what might have been a laugh. "But sometimes crazy is exactly what the galaxy needs." As the reception continued, Jake found himself in conversations with representatives from dozens of different species. Some, like Thok and the Zolani, seemed genuinely supportive of human membership. Others were more skeptical, questioning everything from human military intentions to their emotional stability. The most disturbing conversation came near the end of the evening, when Jake found himself cornered by a group of 3 beings from species he didn't recognize. "Human Martinez," one of them said, a tall being with multiple arms and what looked like scales covering its skin. "I am Trade Master Sectal of the Serpent Consortium. We wish to speak with you about certain concerns regarding your species." "What kind of concerns?" "Economic concerns," replied another of the beings, this one shorter and whiter with thick gray skin. "I am Prophet Seeker Grok of the Merchant Guild. We have analyzed human trade patterns and found them disturbing." Jake frowned. "Disturbing how?" "You give things away," the third being said bluntly. This one was insectoid, similar to the Corvin but smaller and with different coloring. "I am Acquisition Manager Ticket. Our studies show that humans regularly provide aid, resources, and assistance without requiring payment or future obligations. This behavior disrupts established economic models." "You're upset because we help people?" Jake asked incredulously. "We are concerned about market stability," Sectal clarified. "If the precedent is set that aid should be provided freely, it could undermine the entire galactic economy." Jake stared at them for a moment, trying to process what he was hearing. "So you're opposed to human membership because we might be too generous?" "Generosity is inefficient," Grok stated. "It distorts natural market forces and creates unsustainable dependencies." "Maybe some things are more important than market forces," Jake suggested. The 3 beings exchanged what Jake interpreted as uncomfortable glances. "That kind of thinking is exactly what we're worried about," Ticket said. Jake was about to respond when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Ambassador Wells approaching with a concerned expression. "Gentlemen," she said diplomatically, "I hope you're not overwhelming our human representative with too many questions." "Not at all," Sectal replied smoothly. "We were simply clarifying certain economic concerns." After the three beings moved away, Wells shook her head. The Trade Federation species have been some of our strongest opponents. They see human altruism as a threat to galactic commerce. Is it? Jake asked. That depends on your perspective, Wells replied. The galaxy's economy has been based on strict cost-benefit analysis for centuries. The idea that someone might provide aid without expecting something in return challenges some fundamental assumptions. Jake looked around the reception hall, watching the various alien species mingle and network. It struck him that many of these conversations were probably about trade deals, military alliances, and political maneuvering. Very few seemed to be about simply getting to know each other as individuals. Ambassador, he said slowly, what exactly are we getting ourselves into? Wells followed his gaze around the room. The galaxy, Jake. With all its benefits and problems. The question is whether we can maintain our humanity while becoming part of something larger. The reception was winding down, and Jake found himself standing near one of the viewing ports, looking out at the stars. Tomorrow, representatives from 43 different species would vote on whether to accept humanity into their community. The decision would shape the future of human civilization for generations to come. He was startled out of his thoughts by a familiar voice. Jake? He turned to see Lyra approaching, now dressed in formal diplomatic robes that marked her as an official representative of the Zilani government. How are you holding up? She asked. Honestly? I'm not sure I understand what's happening anymore, Jake admitted. Some people seem to think humans are going to save the galaxy, others think we're going to destroy it. All because I helped you get out from under a support beam. Lyra joined him at the viewing port, looking out at the stars. Do you know why I asked you to come to Zelanos? Because you wanted your people to know what happened? Partly, she said. But also because I knew that once they met you, they would understand something important about humanity. What's that? That you don't help people because you expect something in return. You don't calculate the costs and benefits. You just see someone who needs help, and you help them. She paused. That's rare in the galaxy, Jake. Rarer than you might think. Jake thought about his conversations during the reception, the Corvan interest in human military capabilities, the ethereal dismissal of human emotion, the trade concerns about human generosity. Maybe too rare, he said quietly. Maybe, Lyra agreed. Or maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needs. As they stood there looking out at the vast expanse of space, Jake couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow's vote would bring. Would humanity be welcomed into the galactic community, or would they be seen as too different, too unpredictable, too human? Either way, he realized, there was no going back. The story of what had happened on mining station Zirian 7 had spread too far, the implications had become too large. Humanity was about to take its place on the galactic stage, for better or worse. All because one maintenance engineer had decided to help a frightened alien girl. Sometimes, Jake reflected, the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences. Tomorrow, the galaxy would decide whether that was a good thing or a terrifying one. As the reception ended and the various species began departing for their quarters, Jake found himself both hopeful and afraid. The universe was so much larger and more complicated than he had ever imagined, full of wonders and dangers in equal measure. But perhaps that was what made it worth exploring. After all, someone had to be willing to take the risk. The morning of the vote dawned with artificial sunrise that slowly illuminated the main chamber of Harmony Station. Jake Martinez stood before a wall-sized viewport in his quarters, watching ships from across the galaxy maneuvering around the massive space station. Today, representatives from 43 different species would decide humanity's place in the galactic community. Ambassador Wells had briefed him on the voting process over breakfast. Each species would send one representative to speak for or against human membership. Then, there would be a formal vote. They needed a 2/3 majority to pass, 29 votes out of 43. Our best count shows 24 definite yes votes, Wells had explained. 18 definite no votes. 1 abstention. That leaves us short, and there are still some undecided species that could go either way. Jake wasn't supposed to speak during the formal session. His role was to sit in the gallery and represent humanity through his mere presence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that more might be required of him before the day was over. The council chamber was even more impressive than the reception hall had been. It was a vast amphitheater with tiers of seats rising from a central speaking platform. Each species had their own section, marked with holographic displays showing their world and stellar coordinates. The architecture was designed to accommodate beings of widely different sizes and environmental needs. Some sections were filled with water for aquatic species, others maintained different atmospheric compositions. Jake took his assigned seat in the human delegation area, which was located in what Ambassador Wells called the cheap seats, near the back, befitting humanity's status as applicants rather than members. From here, he had a clear view of the entire chamber as it filled with alien representatives. The Zilani delegation was seated not far away, and Jake could see Elder Voss and Lyra among them. The Corvan Empire occupied a section near the front, their insectoid forms gleaming under the chamber's lights. The ethereal collective sat in an area kept deliberately dim, their pale forms almost ghost-like in the shadows. Chancellor Darwin of the Nexus Republic, a species of tall, blue-skinned humanoids who served as the council's administrative leaders, called the session to order with a deep, resonant tone that carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. We are gathered today to consider the application of the species known as humanity for full membership in the Galactic Council, the Chancellor announced. This decision will affect not only the applicant species but the future direction of our entire galactic community. The first speaker was Elder Voss, representing the Zilani delegation. His voice was calm and measured as he addressed the chamber. Honored colleagues, the Zilani people have had the privilege of close contact with humanity over the past several months. We have observed their actions, studied their values, and come to understand what they represent. Today I speak not just as an advocate for their membership, but as someone who has seen firsthand what humans are capable of. Voss went on to recount the story of the mining station incident, but he framed it in terms that Jake hadn't expected. Instead of focusing on the physical rescue, he emphasized the moral implications. When human Jake Martinez found young Lyra trapped in that station, he faced a choice that defines the fundamental nature of his species. He could have calculated the risks, weighed the costs, and chosen the logical path of self-preservation. Instead, he acted from a moral imperative that transcends personal safety or rational calculation. This is not an aberration in human behavior. Our studies suggest it is characteristic of their entire species. Voss paused, looking around the chamber. The question before us today is not whether humans possess useful technology or military strength. The question is whether we want to include a species that consistently chooses moral action over personal advantage. I submit that such a voice is exactly what this council needs. The Zilani elders sat down to what Jake interpreted as polite approval from several delegations. But he could also see some representatives who looked less impressed. The next speaker was War Leader Zixth of the Corvan Empire. His mandibles clicked as he approached the speaking platform, and his compound eyes swept across the chamber with military precision. The Corvan Empire has studied the human application with great interest, Zixth began. We find much to admire in their physical capabilities and tactical adaptability. The incident on mining station Zirian 7 demonstrates both courage and strength that would be valued in our military traditions. Jake felt a moment of hope, but it was quickly dampened by the war leader's next words. However, we have significant concerns about human unpredictability. A species that consistently acts from emotion rather than logic poses risks that cannot be easily calculated. In warfare, unpredictable allies can be as dangerous as enemies. Zixth's testimony focused on human military history, citing examples of both heroic sacrifice and destructive conflict. He painted a picture of a species capable of great courage but also prone to irrational decisions that could destabilize the galaxy's carefully maintained balance of power. The Corvan Empire will abstain from this vote, he concluded. We require more observation before determining whether human membership serves our interests. Jake's heart sank. They had been counting on Corvan support, and an abstention was almost as bad as a no vote. The next several speakers included both supporters and opponents. The Stoneheart Confederation spoke passionately in favor of human membership, with Granite Singer Thok describing humans as kindred spirits who understand the value of hard work and mutual aid. But their support was balanced by opposition from the Trade Federation species, who reiterated their concerns about human economic behavior disrupting established markets. The most damaging testimony came from Prime Scholar Vextal of the Ethereal Collective. The Ethereal Collective has observed human behavior for several decades, Vextal said in a voice that carried clearly despite its soft tone. We have reached conclusions that differ significantly from our colleagues. The Ethereal's large black eyes seemed to focus on Jake as he continued. Humans are indeed capable of remarkable physical feats under stress. They do indeed act from emotional impulses that other species might consider irrational. The question is whether these traits represent evolution or regression. Vextal's argument was coldly logical and devastatingly effective. He presented data showing that species which made decisions based primarily on emotion tended to be less stable, more prone to internal conflict, and ultimately less successful in long-term survival. The Ethereal Collective has transcended such primitive responses, he stated. We make decisions based on logic, efficiency, and optimal outcomes for all involved. We fear that human membership would introduce chaos into our carefully balanced system. As Vextal returned to his seat, Jake could see the impact of his words on the chamber. Several delegations that had seemed supportive now looked uncertain. The debate continued for another hour, with representatives from various species stating their positions. The pattern became clear: species that valued individual achievement and emotional bonds tended to support human membership, while those that prioritized logical analysis and systematic order opposed it. When all the formal speeches were completed, Chancellor Darwin prepared to call for the vote. But, before he could speak, a voice rang out from the gallery. I request permission to address the council. Jake was startled to realize that the voice was his own. He had stood up without thinking, driven by a growing frustration with the way humanity was being discussed as if they were specimens in a laboratory rather than living beings with their own perspective. A murmur ran through the chamber. Ambassador Wells was staring at him with a mixture of alarm and curiosity. Human Jake Martinez, Chancellor Darwin said after a moment of consultation with his advisors, you are not a formal member of any delegation. Do you have standing to address this council? Jake felt every eye in the chamber focused on him. For a moment, he considered sitting back down and letting the vote proceed. But, then, he thought about Lyra trapped under that support beam, and about all the conversations he'd had over the past few months with beings who seemed to think they could understand humanity from the outside. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the chamber's acoustics, I may not be a formal diplomat, but I'm the reason we're all here today. If you're going to vote on whether my species deserves a place in your community, maybe you should hear from someone who actually knows what it's like to be human. Chancellor Darwin looked around the chamber, gauging the reaction of the various delegations. After a moment, he nodded. The council recognizes human Jake Martinez. You may speak. Jake made his way down to the speaking platform on unsteady legs. As he stood where Elder Voss and War Leader XTH and all the others had spoken, he felt the weight of representation for an entire species. Thank you, he began, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. I've been listening to everyone talk about humans like we're some kind of puzzle to be solved. They analyze our behavior, study our history, try to figure out whether we'll be useful or dangerous. But, I don't think anyone has asked the most important question. He paused, looking around at the alien faces watching him. The question isn't whether humans are logical or emotional, predictable or chaotic. The question is whether the galaxy is better or worse when people help each other. Jake pointed toward the Zilani delegation. When I found Lyra trapped under that beam, I wasn't thinking about market forces or military strategies or optimal outcomes. I was thinking about a scared kid who needed help. And, yes, maybe that was irrational. Maybe I should have done a cost-benefit analysis. Maybe I should have considered the larger implications. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But, you know what? If I had stopped to think about all that, she would have died. And, the galaxy would have been a little bit smaller, a little bit sadder, and a little bit less than it should be. Jake turned to face the ethereal delegation directly.
Prime Scholar Vextal, you said that emotional decision-making is primitive and inefficient.
You're probably right. But, let me ask you something, when was the last time your logical, efficient society produced someone willing to die for a stranger?
The chamber was completely silent.
I'm not saying humans are perfect, Jake continued.
We've made terrible mistakes, fought stupid wars, done things we're ashamed of.
But, we've also produced people who run into burning buildings to save others, who give up their own lives to protect people they've never met, who help because helping is what you do. He gestured toward the Trade Federation section.
You're worried about market disruption? Good. Maybe some markets need to be disrupted. Maybe an economy that can't handle generosity isn't worth preserving.
Jake turned back to face the Chancellor.
You want to know what humans will bring to the Galactic Council?
We'll bring the crazy idea that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the smart thing.
We'll bring the belief that every life has value, regardless of species or planet of origin.
And, yes, we'll bring chaos and unpredictability and all the messy complications that come with actually caring about people. His voice dropped to a more personal tone. But, we'll also bring the possibility that when your ship crashes and your life is in danger, someone will come for you. Not because it's profitable, not because it's logical, but because you matter. Jake looked around the chamber one final time.
That's what humans offer the galaxy.
Not perfect logic or optimal efficiency, but the promise that no one has to face the darkness alone.
And if that's not worth having, then maybe this council isn't the organization we thought it was.
He returned to his seat in complete silence.
Ambassador Wells leaned over and whispered, that was either brilliant or catastrophic. Probably both. Chancellor Darwin stood up slowly. Thank you, Human Martinez. The Council will now proceed to vote on the question of human membership. The voting process was computerized, with each delegation entering their choice on secure terminals. The results would be tabulated automatically and announced immediately.
Jake watched the alien representatives making their decisions, trying to read their expressions and body language. It was impossible to tell which way the vote was going.
After what seemed like an eternity, Chancellor Darwin received the results. The vote on human membership in the Galactic Council is as follows, he announced. Yes votes, 31. No votes, 11. Abstentions, 1. The motion passes. The chamber erupted in discussion as various delegations reacted to the results.
Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. Humanity was now officially a member of the Galactic Council.
Ambassador Wells grabbed his arm, grinning broadly. We did it. We actually did it.
As the formal session ended and delegates began mingling, Jake found himself surrounded by well-wishers from various species. But, the most meaningful moment came when Lyra broke away from the Zilani delegation and ran up to him. You did it, she said, hugging him tightly.
You saved me again. I didn't save you, Jake protested. I just told them what I thought. That's exactly what saved me, Lyra replied. And, now it's saved all of humanity.
As the celebration continued around them, Jake couldn't help but reflect on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a maintenance engineer whose biggest concern was fixing atmospheric processors.
Now he was apparently one of the people responsible for humanity's entry into galactic civilization.
Elder Voss approached, his face bearing the Zilani equivalent of a smile.
Congratulations, Human Martinez.
Your speech was most effective.
I was just being honest, Jake said. Indeed, Voss replied.
And that honesty may have been exactly what the council needed to hear. As the day wore on and the implications of the vote began to sink in, Jake realized that this was just the beginning. Humanity would now have a voice in galactic affairs, but they would also have responsibilities they had never imagined. The galaxy was vast and complex, filled with wonders and dangers in equal measure. There would be new challenges ahead, new crises that would test human values and human courage. But, for now, Jake was content to stand with his friends and watch the stars through the station's viewing ports, knowing that humanity had earned its place among them. After all, sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up and be willing to help.
Even if it meant changing the galaxy in the process.
1 year after humanity's acceptance into the Galactic Council, Jake Martinez was beginning to understand that joining the galactic community was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. He stood in the briefing room aboard the human embassy ship Terra Nova, studying a holographic display that showed the Kepler sector in alarming detail.
The situation was bad.
A plague had broken out among the mining colonies of the Tethys system, affecting multiple species but hitting the silicon-based crystalline workers particularly hard. The disease was aggressive, spreading faster than medical teams could contain it, and showed signs of being artificially engineered.
12 colonies affected so far, Admiral Sarah Chen reported to the assembled diplomatic team.
She had been promoted after the mining station incident and now commanded humanity's small but growing galactic fleet. Death toll is approaching 50,000 and rising.
The Council's response has been inadequate.
Jake looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues. Ambassador Wells was there, along with Dr. Maria Santos, humanity's lead xenobiologist, and Commander Blake, who had become Earth's specialist in crisis management. They were all looking at him expectantly, and Jake still wasn't comfortable with that. Over the past year, he had somehow become humanity's unofficial ambassador at large, the person other species turned to when they needed to understand the human perspective on galactic issues. It wasn't a job he had wanted, but it was one he couldn't seem to escape. "What's the Council's position?" he asked. "Quarantine," Ambassador Wells replied with obvious frustration. "They've sealed off the entire Tethys system and are waiting for the plague to burn itself out."
"How many people are we talking about?" Dr. Santos asked. 3.7 million, Admiral Chen answered. "Spread across 18 different worlds and mining platforms." Jake felt sick. "And the Council is just going to let them die?"
"It's not that simple," Wells explained. "The plague appears to be engineered specifically to target multiple species simultaneously. The Council's medical experts believe that attempting rescue operations would only spread the disease to other systems. So their solution is to write off 3.7 million people? From their perspective, it's the logical choice. Sacrifice a few million to save billions." Jake stared at the holographic display, watching the red indicators that marked infected colonies. Each dot represented thousands of lives, families torn apart by disease, children dying while their parents watched helplessly. "There has to be something we can do," he said finally. Commander Blake shook her head. "Our medical capabilities are still decades behind most Council species. We don't have the technology to develop a cure or even slow the spread." "But we have something else," Jake said, an idea beginning to form. "We have the willingness to try." Dr. Santos leaned forward. "Jake, I admire your optimism, but we can't cure a plague through good intentions." "Maybe not. But we can try to help the people who are already infected. Even if we can't save everyone, maybe we can save someone." Admiral Chen frowned. "The Council has explicitly forbidden any intervention in the Tethys system. If we violate that order, it could jeopardize humanity's entire membership." Jake looked around the room at his colleagues. They were good people, dedicated to serving humanity's interests in the galaxy. But they were also diplomats and military officers, trained to think in terms of policy and consequences. "What if we weren't officially acting for Earth?" he asked. "What do you mean?" Wells asked suspiciously. "I mean, what if some humans decided to help on their own initiative? No official government backing, no formal mission orders. Just people who couldn't stand by and watch." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. It was a classic Jake Martinez solution: ignore the politics and focus on helping people who needed help. That would be incredibly dangerous, Wells pointed out. Both physically and politically. "Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Jake replied. "The question is whether it's worth the risk." Dr. Santos was studying her datapad with a thoughtful expression. "Actually, there might be something we could do. We can't cure the plague, but we might be able to set up quarantine facilities to treat the symptoms and keep people comfortable while their immune systems fight the disease."
"Palliative care?" Admiral Chen asked. "More than that.
If we can slow the progression of symptoms and give people's natural defenses time to work, some of them might survive. It wouldn't save everyone, but it could make a difference." Jake felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he heard Lyra crying in the wreckage of the mining station.
"Then, we have to try."
"Jake," Wells said carefully, "if you do this, Earth can't officially support you.
If things go wrong, you'll be on your own." "I understand. And if the Council decides you violated their quarantine orders, they could expel humanity from membership entirely." "I understand that too." Admiral Chen stood up and walked over to the holographic display, studying the infected systems. "How many people would we need for a medical relief operation?"
"A small team," Dr. Santos replied.
"Maybe 24 medical personnel and support staff."
"We'd need fast ships that could slip past the Council blockade."
"I could arrange that," Chen said quietly. "Unofficially, of course." Wells looked around the room with an expression of resigned determination. "This is insane." "You know that, right?"
"Probably," Jake agreed.
"But someone has to try."
3 days later, Jake found himself aboard a modified cargo hauler called the Good Samaritan, watching the Tethys system grow larger on the navigation display. The ship had been hastily converted to carry medical supplies and emergency shelters, and its small crew consisted entirely of volunteers.
Dr. Santos was running final checks on their medical equipment when the communication array crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel, this is the Council patrol ship Harmony's Edge. You are approaching a restricted quarantine zone. Alter course immediately or face interdiction."
Jake looked at Captain Maria Rodriguez, a former Earth Navy officer who had volunteered to pilot their mission.
"Your call, Captain."
Rodriguez was a small, tough woman with graying hair and steady hands. She had served in 3 different humanitarian crises on Earth and volunteered for this mission without hesitation. "Council vessel, this is cargo hauler Good Samaritan," she replied calmly.
"We are carrying medical supplies for relief operations."
"Good Samaritan, you do not have authorization for entry into the quarantine zone.
Withdraw immediately." Jake took over the communication. "Harmony's Edge, this is Jake Martinez."
"I'm sure you've heard of me." There was a long pause before the response came.
"Human Martinez, you are hereby ordered to withdraw from this system immediately. Entry into the quarantine zone is forbidden by Council decree."
"I understand the decree," Jake replied. "But people are dying down there, and we have medical supplies that might help."
"Are you really going to stop us from trying to save lives?" Another pause. "Our orders are clear.
If you continue on your current course, we will be forced to disable your vessel."
Jake looked around at his crew.
They were all watching him, waiting to see what he would do. These people had volunteered to risk their lives to help strangers, just like he had on the mining station.
He couldn't let them down. "Harmony's Edge, let me ask you something. If it was your family down there, dying from this plague, would you want someone to try to help them?"
The silence stretched for nearly a minute. When the reply finally came, the voice sounded different somehow.
"Good Samaritan, this is Commander Thexval of the patrol ship Harmony's Edge.
I am ordering my vessel to experience technical difficulties with our sensors. We will be unable to detect unauthorized vessels for approximately 6 hours."
Jake grinned. "Thank you, Commander. We'll make those 6 hours count."
The Good Samaritan slipped past the Council blockade and headed for the nearest infected colony, a mining platform orbiting the system's 4th planet. As they approached, Jake could see that the situation was even worse than the reports had indicated. The mining platform was a massive structure designed to house nearly 100,000 workers and their families. But the lights were dim, the docking bays showed signs of damage, and there was no response to their communication attempts.
"Looks like we're going in blind," Captain Rodriguez observed.
They docked at an emergency airlock and suited up in full biohazard gear. Dr. Santos had configured their medical sensors to detect the plague organism, and the readings were alarming.
Contamination levels are off the charts, she reported. This entire platform is saturated with the pathogen. They made their way through empty corridors toward the platform's medical center.
The silence was eerie, broken only by the hum of life support systems and the occasional groan of stressed metal. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow that made the place feel like a tomb. They found the first survivors in the medical center, about 30 people of various species huddled together in what had been the main treatment ward. Most were unconscious.